Evening. I'd like to call the General Plan Working Group Committee to order. May we have roll call, please?
Councilmember Stanish.
Yes. But I'm a committee member here.
Oh, committee member. Committee member Lisa Heckman. Committee member Edwin Okamura.
Here.
Committee member Tom Donnelly.
Here.
Committee member Emmett Keith Hotslander.
Here.
Committee member Art Darden, not yet here. Committee member alternate Judith Adamson.
Here, I think I'm not an alternate
She's not an
anymore.
alternate.
Oh, it says, oh, sorry. Okay. Committee member Rick Dolk,
No, I'm an alternate, but I'm here.
alternate. I'm basically on an old list. I apologize. Committee member alternate Lisa Duke.
Here.
Thank you.
All right. Will you join me in the Pledge of Allegiance, please? I'd like to open it up for public comment. Does anybody here have any public comment that they'd like to talk about of something that's not on the agenda tonight? Sarah, nothing? Okay, I'll close public comment unless we have something online. Anything else?
There are no raised hands.
Okay, thank you. Then public comments closed. We need to approve the minutes from the meeting of July 7th, 2022. Anybody have any questions or do we have a motion?
I'll make a motion to approve.
All right, we have a second.
Second.
Call, please.
Committee member Stanish.
Yes.
Committee member Heckman. Yes. Committee member Okamura.
Yes.
Committee member Donnelly.
Yes.
Committee member Hoslander.
Yes.
Committee member Darden is absent. Committee member Adamson.
Yes.
Motion's approved on the minutes. Okay, we're going to go to the discussion for the general plan land use element. And this is the initial discussion. Paul, it's all yours. We're on hold, everybody, so.
Mayor, members of the commission, good evening. This evening, we are going to be delving into land use. We're really starting to work in earnest on the general plan. This meeting may go a little bit longer than some of our previous meetings. So we hope you can bear with us, but we have a lot of material to cover. And what we gain out of this meeting will be direction that allows us to move forward with drafting the land use element, as well as taking on some of the more significant issues that have to be considered, mainly about changes in land use designations. So with that. So first, we're going to talk a little bit about land use designations in general and some changes that we would recommend and would like to have the commission or the committee's endorsement for. We are going to go over constraints that we're facing in Rio Vista that will shape the community and items that we need to consider as we prepare the general plan. Then we'll be going over opportunity sites. That will be probably the longest part of our discussion because there's about 10 areas around the city that we want to point out to you and give you our evaluation and then learn what you understand about these sites as members of the community. And then finally, we'll talk about what does build out of Rio Vista look like for both the general plan horizon and the ultimate build out, because understanding where we're going in the future helps us to guide the uses, the facilities and the improvements we need to support that community. Am I coming through okay on the mic with everyone? Okay. Land use 101, just before we get started, I wanted to circle back with this kind of hierarchy. This may be old news to some, it may be a little bit new, but just to make sure we understand where we're at with these documents that we're working on. The general plan is often referred to as the Bible of land use of the city. It is the most senior document, and everything that flows down from it legally must be consistent with the general plan. Oftentimes, the council or the commission will have to make determinations that some action is consistent with the general plan. So this is really the guiding light for the city. It's a vision document. It's not a detailed implementation document, but it does set the direction and provides the framework for other documents to then implement those policies and goals. Zoning code is a very different animal. It's detailed. It gets down to specific standards, specific uses that are allowed subject to use permit, how far a building needs to be from a property line, very detailed. And that's what we rely upon when we start to look at projects that we're reviewing. The last really important type of document, and this is very relevant in Rio Vista, is specific plans. Specific plans is, in essence, create a unique zoning code for a smaller unit of land. Trilogy is a specific plan. It has its own development standards. So we have Trilogy, we have Gibbs Ranch Liberty, we have Grand Ranch, and a couple others. And each of these really take on a unique set of standards and regulations. But again, they have to be consistent with the general plan. So I wanted to just kind of remind everyone where we're at. We are working at this highest level. The general plan is the document that guides the vision of the city. Where are we now? This is the land use document or the land use diagram from our current general plan. Candidly, this document is difficult. There's aspects of it that, having looked at it for some time, I still do not quite understand what it's attempting to convey. There's some symbologies on here that are not in the legend, so I don't quite understand how to interpret it. And there's some issues here. We have already been building a more modern general plan land use diagram that will rely on colors versus black and white, and will also be web-based so that anybody will be able to access it and zoom right into their own property and say, my general plan is this and my zoning is that. So we'll remove a lot of the guesswork that currently, as a staff member working on planning projects, I sometimes stumble in being able to know exactly how to interpret certain uses. We also, within the general plan, have a focused area plan for the downtown. And so we can see the uses. The Highway 12 is kind of running through the upper middle of the project, and the downtown waterfront designation and neighborhood residential, and these are all the designations on the plan. So we'll be replacing these with just a single document that will provide more clarity and more certainty for people who are viewing it. These are the current general plan land use designations. There's 20 of them. I think that's more than we need. I think that there's some issues here as far as some of the designations are a bit repetitive, or maybe they're like something else, or they create a distinction that then isn't carried forward in any other documents. So it's a little bit meaningless when we have a unique general plan designation, but there's nothing that then implements it in the zoning code. So we're going to look at these designations and look back at the zoning and look at what's on the ground and try to decide, where do we really want to regulate things differently? we have an historic residential general plan designation. Do we really want to regulate the historic or the older buildings within Rio Vista differently? And maybe we do, but we need to consider that so that we don't wind up having designations that functionally are really no different. It just adds confusion and it makes it harder for the public, staff, commission, and council. So we'll be going through these various designations and making recommendations on how they might be consolidated, or maybe we'll keep all of them, or maybe some of them will be retitled a little bit. But that's something staff's going to be working on. And the next time we come back on land use, we'll say, we've looked through it and here's what we recommend. So at that point, we'll really start to look at what the land use element is going to contain. This is just an excerpt. It was one of the land use designations in the general plan. A couple of things are a bit unique about this. One being that there's a written description of where this district exists. Well, if we have a map, we know where it exists. So we really don't need to have a written description that says south of Highway 12 and east of such and such. So I think we can do away with that. More significantly, and this is something that I really want to hear the input from the working group. This is an employment district, industrial employment, and it designates that there should be, not should, that there shall be a certain number of employees per acre. And that's a bit troubling because it's hard to regulate a use to say you have to have a certain number of employees per square foot of building or per acre. And that's a standard that I'd like to discuss eliminating with the working group, because regulating businesses by the number of employees can be challenging. It's much easier to regulate them by type. If you want higher density employment, don't allow warehousing in a certain district. If you want retail in your downtown, don't allow office, but you can regulate by the uses so that you have a set of uses that implement the vision for the community. For staff or a commission or a council to regulate by the number of employees within a building is challenging. So we're recommending that that be eliminated. The following is not intended to be our recommended language, but it illustrates what we think is a better way to describe what these districts are. This is fairly conventional, and what you'll see in general plans is really just a written description. So we have this use, industrial employment limited, and we start out by saying generally, what are we trying to do? We want to accommodate employment in retail and light industrial, so a range of uses. Generally, uses like the following are considered appropriate. This is starting to get into a fair amount of detail that we may or may not want to retain, but it does start to illustrate what we think industrial employment light should be. And then the final statement is we shouldn't have uses with significant impacts, noise, odors, vibration. Those are uses that we typically associate with heavy industrial. So light industrial is not the place for the concrete crushing plant. It's not the place for the asphalt batch plant. Those uses shouldn't be in light industrial. And so that's what that statement is offering. And then this is a statement of the character. And the challenge right now in Rio Vista is light industrial is applied pretty widely to a range of uses. The business park has a certain level of finish, and we strive for a certain quality of design. In warehousing or actual light industrial assembly, we probably wouldn't want to strive for the same level of design necessarily. So this statement right now works well for our current light industrial or industrial employment limited. But I think we're going to need to consider whether we want to try to address a whole range of uses with one use, general plan use type. So that's another discussion that we'll bring up. So generally, we're suggesting moving away from the table form into a more descriptive statement about the district. Provide enough guidance so that we understand what the district is about. And the public could look at and say, oh, I get it. This is what the character of this district is. And also move away from the establishing the employment requirements. So that was a lot about general plan designations. I'd be interested in taking a moment now and just seeing what comments the commission has on the approaches I've just discussed.
I agree with the suggestions you're making here. That's kind of weird, the setup with the number of employees per square foot or whatever. That, I don't know that I've ever seen anything like that before. You know, I'm not a planner per se or anything like that, but I've dealt with a number of these kinds of issues in my career that just is really odd. But I think your description, written description is probably a little better way to go than the table, or you somehow consolidate that table and make it better, where you have these written descriptions in there, you know, something maybe like a hybrid of the two.
I would like to echo the hybrid. As somebody who's more of a layperson and trying to understand comparisons, if I were just looking at something on the website, if I could have a table that showed the different designations with maybe a statement, not a big description where I could go to a different page, would be helpful if I was trying to advocate for myself or lobby or do something like that, to be able to see what the different options and language was being used by the city would be helpful.
I think I just heard that a summary table would be helpful in addition to the, okay. great.
Yes, please.
Comments?
Oh, I was just going to concur with Lisa. I mean, I think that for me, it's also difficult for me to absorb a big paragraph like this while we sit up here. So we probably would want to go back and absorb it a little bit. But at a high level, I agree in that I want a bulleted point thing where I could just quick snapshot, see what it is. I think it's easier for the planning commission as well when they're reviewing different ordinances and whatnot, that they could look quickly and just say, yeah, that fits or that doesn't fit. And I agree with regards to the number of employees, because for instance, I would think that the new, the storage facility out on River Road, that's large acreage, but they probably don't have very many employees. So that would be a big issue there.
Yeah, just a quick comment. I agree with not having the statement specifics about employment there. I think the context was when this general plan was done, there really was very little development that was done out at the Rio Vista Business Park. And there was concern that it was just going to become a bunch of warehouses and not places where there would be a significant amount of employment. But now that it's become more developed, you know, I think we see where it is and that it actually is becoming an employment center. So we probably don't have to be as descriptive at this point.
Judy? No, you just turn yourself off. There you go. Speak into the microphone.
Where it says, in all cases, buildings should include an appropriate level of architectural interest, et cetera. Should we put in environmental sustainability, or is that a different topic than just discussing paragraph form versus table?
We probably will address environmental sustainability as a separate overarching topic, but I do want to reiterate, this is just plug language. This
Okay.
is not a proposal. So for now, this was intended to be illustrative of what the description would be. We'll come back. So don't think that you have to work this one over yet, because we'll have full descriptions of each district that will come back to you for detailed review. But I do believe that as far as environmental sensitivity, we'll be covering that in both the conservation element and then probably primarily in conservation.
Is there anybody online that has any questions for Phil or comments? I'm sorry for Paul.
There are no raised hands right now, Mr. Chair. I do like to acknowledge the presence of alternate Mary Ellen Lamoth from the beginning of the meeting.
Thank you.
Add one, just small question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just in this, typically circulation for large vehicles should be accommodated and pedestrian facilities shall be incorporated in projects. What does pedestrian facilities mean?
Sidewalks at least.
Okay. Thank you.
I have a comment or a question too. The one person per 50 or 1,500 square feet is kind of odd, but when we approve projects, especially out the business park, we kind of get a feeling for them, how many employees they have by parking spaces. So that kind of really blows that almost out of the water as far as I'm concerned. And Edwin touched a little bit about the storage facility out there. We were on planning commission, we struggled with that when it came to us. Because we felt that just because it's on the other side of the bridge, doesn't mean it's not part of the waterfront. And it seemed like a really great property to kind of, unfortunately, use for storage. It could be condos, it could be a lot of other great things. So I think when we talk about certain areas like that, I think we have to be a little more flexible in some of this zoning. And that one in particular, because it didn't go through planning commission, but it was appealed through city council and city council approved it. And I understand why. And I was one of the people that voted against it. But it still leaves the fact that that's really still prime property. And I think, in my opinion, that's one of the areas in town that really and truly should get cleaned up with this general plan, I hope.
We will be talking about that tonight.
Okay.
That is the most interesting land use discussion we have in this general plan.
Okay. Thank you. Anybody else with any more questions before we move on? Okay.
Okay, well, thank you. We're now going to share with you some of the constraints that we have become aware of as the staff working on the plan, but we're also interested in hearing from you as members of the community, the commission, council, if you're aware of other constraints we should be thinking about. But we do also want to frame up what we think are some of the issues that are going to guide and in some cases limit and restrict the growth of Rio Vista. So those are, in no particular order, airport flight zones, so safety zones related to the Rio Vista Airport. They establish constraints on the use of land. FEMA flood areas, we mainly, eastish, northeast of town, we have flooding coming off the river. There's a floodplain there, and we have land that's mapped in the 100-year flood. We also were uncertain what's going to happen with various flood control improvements, which might change the landscape of flooding. And of course, we don't know what's going to happen with sea level rise and how that's going to affect us. So there's a lot packaged up in flooding that we don't have perfect information, other than we have areas that are more subject to flooding and areas that are less subject. The Flannery properties are biggest landholder in Solano County, and we will share with you exactly what that means in a minute. And the natural gas facilities, which has been somewhat vexing in my experience so far, because we have some very low yield wells that people are keeping in operation so that they don't have to incur the expense of abandoning a well, because abandoning a well, as I understand, is a $200,000 proposition. And so it's a lot better to get $5 of gas a month than spend $200,000. And I just made up a number. So, but we have some low yield wells, and we have also some wells that are probably still more productive. And then we have natural gas lines. So all of those are a constraint within Rio Vista because of the historic resources that were here, even if they are largely extracted. We still have a system of infrastructure that needs to be considered. So running through those. This is the diagram from the airport land use compatibility plan prepared for the Rio Vista Airport. I can share with you that these are safety zones. So we have safety zones 1 through 6. But really, the quick summary here is the gray area surrounding the airport is a traffic zone. Relatively low implications as far as use restrictions. You can have houses there, you can have fairly dense populations of people. Any of the other colors, the reds, the pinks, the greens, purples, those are all safety zones with greater constraints to one degree or another. You'll see that area, the green zone extending over Brand Ranch. That's the lowest tier of the actually restrictive zones, but there's limits on the number of houses that could be built per acre. There's limits on the number of people that can congregate on any 1 acre. So not the highest level of restrictions, but still a constraint on Brand Ranch. And then the green coming downward from the airport is actually right next to Trilogy, and that's the open land, and it's why that land wasn't developed within Trilogy because of this overflight constraint. So the airport needs to be considered. It has some direct impacts on a few properties, and we'll have to kind of work around those properties as we contemplate how the city might develop in the future.
Paul, can you go back to that for a second?
Yep.
The area where it says potential industrial, with it's got the dotted line, it kind of goes over the approach of the airport. That's a little confusing for me. We certainly can't build on that.
Well, no, actually, when we were identifying potential areas, and this is GIS layers, understand, and the potential districts, you see Brand Ranch and then others, were built on a layer. I actually hadn't taken a close look and realized it. That potential district that's almost like a cutoff triangle is configured that way mainly because of flooding, but it really should have been pulled back out of the airport zone.
Okay.
We will have to look at that particular zone and understand what the use restrictions are. The pinks and the purples are not no build, but they are limited as far as the number of employees that you could have per acre. So they're not strictly speaking off limits, but they are more constrained. Anything else on the airports? Okay. So flooding, what we see here is generally the Sacramento River floodplain is coming at us from the east northeast. And so, and all of those edges out beyond the airport, and some of the potential industrial lands, in fact, some of the existing industrial lands furthest out on Highway 84 are already subject to 100-year flooding. So this is information we're going to be considering and thinking about as we look at potential growth. We probably will not be proposing any expansion of the city eastward from the airport, regardless of any airport-related issues. We just have flooding issues. Now, there are some significant flood control plans under consideration. There has been some discussion of actually flooding lands to the east of the airport. My understanding is that there have been commitments made by state agencies that land won't be flooded because it would result in attraction of waterfowl that would create airport hazards. So we're going to be working through all of that, as well as what it might mean to have something approaching a YOLO bypass, which I think you're all familiar with how that flows between Davis and West Sacramento, this very large area that usually looks like farmland, and in really big storms looks like an ocean. But now we're downstream from that, and there may be something akin to the YOLO bypass in the vicinity of Rio Vista. So we're going to be continuing to work with our public works folks. There are some preliminary plans for flood control improvements, but that will help us to understand how we should be planning along that eastern edge of Rio Vista. And in some ways, the improvements may actually open up some land and protect some land from flooding. So we may actually see some improvements to flood risk, but certainly a big factor that we're looking at in the future of Rio Vista. And here are the current holdings of the Flannery Group. Okay, so Rio Vista is it does not. Okay. Thank you. It's like, why is it going off every time I pointed at the TV? You can see Rio Vista, and Flannery is really coming at us from the north and the west. It hasn't gotten to the Brand Ranch property, but it's a half section away. That's a half mile away. There's also property that the Flannery Group has acquired that's actually inside the city's sphere of influence adjacent to Sandy Beach. So we're seeing encroachments of this property ownership group. And my understanding of the terms of their purchase is that if a landowner sells to this group, they're allowed to stay for quite an extended period, I believe 35 years or until they pass away. So that's a very odd term of acquisition. I'm going to buy your land, and by the way, I'm going to pay 50% over market value, and you can live on it for 30 years. That math doesn't make sense to me, but I think from our perspective, we're assuming that if Flannery owns property, we should not anticipate that it's going to be available for development in the term of this general plan at least. So unless we learn something different, but a number of people, individuals, agencies have tried to understand the intentions of the Flannery Group. And at this point, not understanding what their long-term goals are, we think it's prudent to just assume that land held by Flannery should not be anticipated for development in this general plan cycle.
Mary Ellen has a question. She's online.
Mary Ellen?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Okay, I understand that in addition to being able to live on their land for 30 years or whatever, that they also can retain all of their rights, mineral and gas rights, and anything below the ground. It is indeed a very unusual thing, and we're really landlocked, or we will be landlocked, because they continue to contact and push on all of these landowners around here.
Indeed. And we simply don't understand, and it's hard to understand what the intention of the Flannery Group is, but for now, we will look at land that's not held by Flannery as potential expansion areas. And to the extent additional lands are acquired, we'll start to take those off of our long-term plans.
Mhm.
Have they actually been asked, or is it a group that has a physical place where they meet or do their business, or do we know anything else about them?
We have an office in New York.
Ah, Okay,
That's
say no
kind of-
more.
That's pretty close to what we know is there's an individual who's been identified and there's an office in New York. And there's organizations much higher up than the city of Rio Vista who are curious about the Flannery Group's interests. But to date, I've heard speculation, but it seems like rumors to me. So until the ownership group makes clear what their intentions are, we just don't. Okay. So that concludes our discussion of the constraints. These are the big movers. What we don't have is a map of the natural gas facilities. I'm going to just convey what I've been told by individuals in the city. But one of our largest projects, Del Rio Hills, I've been told that the amount of natural gas infrastructure on the property makes it unlikely to anticipate development within this cycle of the general plan, which we can think of as being 20 years. So that's kind of what we're dealing with. I did assist with processing the Liberty project. We're building houses around wells in the Liberty project because there's a well that's being retained, and until it's abandoned, closed out, that land will not be developed and there'll be a fence around it. So to some extent, we are coexisting with the drill sites. Not optimal, but as we get in areas where there's more facilities and more infrastructure, it just makes development that much more difficult. So we will be looking at where the greatest density of well infrastructure is, and probably anticipate those are less likely to develop just because of the expense, the cost of abandoning the wells. All right, I'm happy to say that at this point, my partner in the general plan effort, Nick Perdakis, is going to take over and start walking us through opportunity sites. Nick, are you with us?
I am. Can you hear me?
I can. If you just ask me to advance, I'll move the slide forward.
Okay, sounds good. Hello, everyone. I just wanted to note that Eunice Van on our team, her video was turned off. So Pam or someone else who's running the video.
Okay, which one? Oh, Eunice, okay. Hold on for just 1 minute.
Thank you.
Eunice has been made into a co-host.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Paul. Yeah, so I'll be talking for the next few moments here about opportunity sites for new development in the city. And this is really land in the city that meets kind of 4 criteria that we're looking at in the city or outside the city boundaries. So it would include land that is appropriately designated for development in the general plan today, in the existing general plan. It also, some of these sites or properties are land in the city that may require reclassification of a general plan land use category or designation. It's also land that we're looking at in the current sphere of influence. So these would be areas that could be potentially annexation areas outside of the city limits today, or it could be land currently outside the sphere of influence. So these would be also potential expansion areas beyond the sphere of influence area. So we're going to be talking about and showing 10 sites or areas outside the city. And Paul, if you'd like to put up the first site, or actually we have the map first that we're going to show. This is an overview of our opportunity sites that we're looking at and land use ideas for those sites. I think you notice some of these properties being shown in dashed lines on the previous constraints map. So these are the same ones that you were seeing before, but we are labeling here on the existing general plan land use map, which you can see in the legend, the different general plan land use designations and the colors for each of those land use classifications. And then the opportunity sites and areas that we're looking at with the boxes, being pointing to the properties. And then just for your knowledge, the red boundary that you're seeing is the existing city boundaries today. And then the blue boundaries that you're seeing are sphere of influence area just outside the city limits. Next slide.
We pause for a second. Is everybody familiar with the distinction of sphere of influence? Is that term known to everybody?
No.
No.
The city limits identifies those lands that are, we call them the incorporated lands, but they are under the jurisdiction of the city. The city council makes land use decisions. We control those lands. There's an agency called LAFCO, Local Agency Formation Commission, that determines whether land can get added to the city. And the city proposes something called a sphere of influence. The sphere of influence should identify those lands where we anticipate the city expanding, typically somewhere around 10 to 20 years of development should be contained within the sphere of influence. And once it's designated as that, the city can then consider annexation. We cannot annex land that's not within our sphere of influence. So the sphere really is kind of identifying where we think we're going. And this is something we're going to want to talk about in this land use discussion, is we may want to propose modifying the sphere of influence in certain areas and expanding it in areas where we don't currently have additional sphere of influence. Any questions on that? Go ahead, Nick.
Okay, we can go ahead and go to the next slide, which will be the Army-based property. Our first site we'll be discussing tonight. This area is approximately 28 acres in size and guided by a base reuse plan about 20 years ago that discussed several opportunities for the site, including educational and institutional uses, such as a science and interpretive center, research laboratory, and environmental research facilities. But most of the land was being looked at for public, active, and passive recreation. So community recreation centers, some sports fields, perhaps a park and walkways leading from the downtown area into the Army-based property. For constraints, next slide, please. Excuse me, we have some more opportunities that we're also looking at in terms of the property in the future, including commercial recreation. There looks like there could be some opportunities as well that have been identified for a marina, boat launch, and perhaps some recreation serving retail. So just a little bit of land for perhaps a restaurant on the property and some recreation retail. And for opportunities, we feel like this would attract a lot of new development to the city, potentially, including housing and jobs. So it would really be a good positive bonus to the city if this redeveloped and was redesigned. And for constraints for the property, as Paul had mentioned before, frequent flooding could be a challenge in the future with rising sea levels. In terms of structures already on the property, likely would require some removal. There may be some that could be adaptively reused, but likely most would be needing to be removed on the site as the property changes over time. And infrastructure extensions would also be required. Time moves on. Next slide.
Did we want to see if there's comments as we go through each of these?
Oh, I think I have one recommendation.
Great, there, thank you.
No problem. So our recommendation for the property in terms of the general plan and the general plan designation would be to retain the existing GP designation of Army-based reuse area, which allows for a mix of uses and activities on the property, as I just described. And the city would need to continue to seek grant funding and look for partnerships for improving the site for new site development. So we'd like to hear some of your comments or ideas that you may be thinking of as we look through the site and some of the opportunities and constraints.
Has that site been cleaned up hazmat wise? The Army or Navy, well, usually it has to do that. I just didn't know.
It's certainly not been fully cleaned up. We know that the existing structure has lead paint and asbestos. There may be other contamination. I did hear at lunch that there may be some remediation activities underway, but certainly not, it's not a clean site.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we just need to keep focused on the fact that this is just such a prime property, waterfront property, that we have in the community. And the last thing we need to do is to put buildings on there that close it up to access to the public and to commercial opportunities. I think it really does need to be looked at as kind of a mixed use opportunity there, because I think the waterfront is an attractive area for residential, maybe more high density residential or medium density residential, certainly not single family homes. So I think we need to look at this as a real opportunity that can move the community to a new place. I mean, the idea of this government facility has been something that's been thrown around for 20 plus years now. And it seems like, it could be an opportunity to bring, some new people to the community and some really good jobs to the community. I think the other thing that we need to consider also in considering, park and open space kinds of facilities is to look at them and how they would work in concert with the county park, so that we aren't doing something that's duplicating services that are already available through that. So something that can just kind of expand on the offerings that county park offers.
I think as well, in the original plan, it was designated, there was a 12-acre parcel that was designated for the community and for parkland or whatever. I was wondering if it also could be, if it needs to be so rigid to define a specific area versus saying a percentage, for instance, 30% of this said land is going to be used for parkland. And then if a developer were to come in and say, hey, I want to put mixed use, I want to put high density housing here, but we're going to have parkland, we're going to have access to the river, would that work, or are we deed restricted here? I've always heard that there were restrictions on this property. I'm wondering what it would take to remove those restrictions and whether we could be more flexible as the others were talking about.
There usually are restrictions when the federal government conveys land to local agencies. It's not uncommon to have specifications about how the land can be used. I have not read the conveyance documents. I'm not familiar with them. I think the question before this group is, do we have enough in the general plan to describe what we expect of the Army-based property? We're not going to take on a detailed Army-based property planning effort at this time.
Right.
That may be a follow-up action. You may want to make that a program within the general plan to consider, what would be the most appropriate uses, what would be the actions if we wanted to expand the allowed. There could be a lot of things to investigate. We think at this point in the general plan, probably just a description of this really wonderful asset and the various ways it could be used is about as far as we think we want to go, as compared to trying to plan it within this general plan update.
Sure. And I guess that's my question then, is that we're going to describe what we would ideally want on this property, yet there's deed restrictions on the property that would say that we could not do that. Is that not correct? It seems that way.
I think that on a parallel track, we can look into the conveyance documents and find out what those restrictions are, so that we don't in any way contradict what's actually allowed. So that makes a lot of sense. That's
okay.
Anything else on the Army?
So is this the recommendation? Is this the extent of what would go in the general plan? Basically what you just said, or can we gear it a little bit more to something happening with it?
There's two ways that you could accomplish that. One is be a little bit more descriptive of the character, the feel, what you think should go on the property, which candidly is challenging because I've heard lots of people who love this site but think that it would be best used in different ways.
Mhm.
So you would have to coalesce around some kind of a recommendation, or maybe a a fairly open recommendation that suggests the types of uses, a range, not necessarily 1, 2, and 3, but it could, these uses would be appropriate. I think the Army base is such an important asset that it bears some recognition. And then the other thing you could do is consider actions that you want to direct the city over some period of time to accomplish, either planning or marketing or cleaning up, or, you know, what does it make sense for the city to do so that we don't open up the general plan in 2045 and say, boy, this is a great piece of property, we really ought to do something. So this is one of your great assets for sure.
I like what you just said about expanding the description of it at least, and making some recommendations for timing of when the city should start to really
So again,
buy
there's a
it or
couple,
develop.
I'm sorry.
No,
I'm
go
sorry,
ahead.
there's a couple issues though. It's any, whether we can go to the federal government, are there case studies of approaching the federal government and saying, can we change the uses on this land? Because it seems like it's going to be a little more restrictive than we potentially would want. And when we talk to developers, we're going to want to say, yes, you could do it. But then if we have restrictions and we can't change it, then we're going to be stuck.
Will the federal government continue to own it?
No,
No,
it's
the city-
ours,
the city
but there are
owns it,
restrictions
But
on
there's
it.
restrictions when they gave it to us.
Oh, okay.
So what I'm hearing is, first of all, already noted, we will get a handle on what the actual use restrictions are, so we can speak more informed about that. I'm hearing that a description of at least a character, a feel, and what this property could bring to the city is appropriate in the general plan.
I
And
like-
possibly you'll identify some actions as we get into that phase of the general plan. As far as actions that you think the city should undertake, whether that's cleaning up, whether that's allowing more flexibility of uses, whatever those are, we'll talk about those later, but some implementation programs associated. Is that fair?
Sounds good to me.
Paul, one of the issues in my opinion, is that we were so focused on one item that we were going to do out at the Army base that we never had a plan B. And I think this kind of would free up some of that so that we can be a little more flexible. And maybe we shouldn't just look in one direction. Maybe we should go parallel with two different plans. So if one doesn't seem to pan out, we still have something in the fire.
The one use is DWR, fisheries, science.
Yes,
research. Okay.
right.
Yeah, and we don't know when the state's gonna move on that. so. Okay, great. Nick, talk to us about the waterfront.
So this is the area along the waterfront, just south of the bridge. This area has been identified in a few different planning studies over the years as an opportunity area for new development, infill and redevelopment. The boundaries that we're showing here, the yellow boundaries, is about 22 acres in size. And for opportunities, infill and redevelopment of downtown existing properties with some new uses such as commercial, perhaps medium to high density residential and mixed use would seem appropriate. Providing some additional public open space and public gathering spaces next to the river for community events and gatherings would make sense in this area. And this would help add some new businesses and residences to the downtown area and really look to provide an identity and community identity for this part of downtown and really improve it. Next slide, please. Again, this is along the waterfront, so we do have issues with flooding potentially over time. Today, it is designated as downtown waterfront in the general plan. And there's really not much new with this area and what's been identified over several years in different plans. So we feel like maintaining this as a downtown waterfront land use designation would make sense. There might be some tweaking of the downtown waterfront land use category to allow some of the uses we just discussed, such as medium to high density residential, it is allowed now, but maybe there's some tweaking of some of the densities or FDR in the general plan to allow this area to redevelop over time. So I'd like to hear your thoughts and any comments that you might have.
I think that we, at the staff level, feel like you have some pretty good plans for the waterfront. The waterfront specific plan covers this area. It does it in a high level of detail. Is there something we don't understand? Is there something in the general plan that we need to focus on? I hear over and over, we want more businesses, we want more access to the river. We think we understand those, and those will be embodied in the general plan. Is there something more that we need to do with this property?
Is there any benefit to thinking of all of the waterfront almost as a contiguous, where we just came off of the Army base as some sort of designation? We now have this downtown waterfront designation that have similar access or similar needs to the water. Is there any benefit to actually just designating, not designating those two areas any differently, but as maybe phases of specific categories, or a specific category of a waterfront versus downtown Army base, beyond the bridge, whatever the next one, industrial light, I think is where the next one.
I think that as we identified opportunity sites, we were narrow focused on where could we build stuff? Where is there vacant land? Where could we see some redevelopment? But what you're describing makes a lot of sense in an overarching Sandy Beach to the bridge, maybe Sandy Beach to beyond the bridge. So that has a lot of merit. I think there's been is bridge to beach the right name, the trail? That concept. So yes, those planning concepts absolutely have a place. We were kind of looking at land that has the potential to develop in the near term as opportunity sites. But I'm going to take that theme down as one of the concepts that we wanted to benefit.
Mary Ellen has her hand up.
Can you hear me? Is there any way that we can encourage some of these land owners that own a great deal of that waterfront area? I'm just thinking where that big parking space is next to the promenade, and even across. I mean, it's prime area for a hotel or other development like that, but not when it's in the hands of people who haven't done anything with it for the last 75 years.
We have had some discussions with property owners about hotels. We would love to see activity happen on those properties. I think everyone in this room has wanted that for a lot longer than I've ever been visiting Rio Vista. But the reality is there's limits to what we can do as far as encouraging property owners to do something with their land. We can incentivize, we can remove barriers, we can describe a vision, we can encourage, cajole, and cheerlead, but at the end of the day, the property owner has to decide to move forward with a project. So there are certain things we can do, and our city clerk is working with an economic development consultant right now, and so parallel track, we're going to have an economic development plan that's coming in. If we can demonstrate to property owners that there's a return on investment, that there's a benefit to doing something, then that might encourage them towards action. But this is all about carrots and not much about sticks.
Mm-hmm.
We can offer incentives, but we can't really force folks to do anything with their land.
I had one comment I wanted to make. Could we possibly scroll back to the downtown map? Yeah. So what this area is stopping at Main Street. I'm saying that, Paul, I'm really not trying to take away your office, but I think City Hall should be part of
You're
this.
after my window, aren't you?
But I think the City Hall site should be included as part of this consideration because I think it's really an important connectivity
Good
area.
catch, yeah.
And I haven't given a whole lot of thought to it. It just came up just now with Lisa, and I think that's a fantastic idea of looking holistically at our entire waterfront so that, and this goes for developers as well, it's just the whole vision for our entire waterfront and what we want to and how we want it to be used ultimately. I think it's because for one, I'm all about connectivity, and I think everyone here feels the same way, that the connectivity between the north side of Highway 12 and the south side of Highway 12 is very disconnected. And by bringing those two districts together, if I want to call it that, from the downtown waterfront to River Road on up to Airport Road, if we tied those together, then it would make it very clear that we have to have connectivity between those two. So my initial thought is really, I like the idea of looking at it more holistically.
I completely agree with that. I think it's hard to take it in pieces. You almost have to look at the entire waterfront, even where those private residences are. You're probably gonna have to do something building into the river, along the river's edge there, because you don't want to run those people out, but you've got to find a way to connect the whole length. It's just tough to take it in little pieces like this, to me.
What I'm taking out of this is maybe, yes, we should be looking at the vacant land opportunity, but the bigger play here is a waterfront that extends from north of the bridge out to Sandy Beach, and think about that as a unit rather than thinking about this area and focusing on this area. I mean, we probably all look at that vacant or underutilized land and think, gosh, this could be something wonderful, and it really could be. But those two visions aren't separate. This is probably just a piece of that bigger picture. Okay. I think we have what we were after on this one. And now the discussion.
Committee member Lamont has her hand up.
Yeah, I mean, why isn't, and maybe Edwin already mentioned this, but why isn't our waterfront, or could our waterfront area be extended all the way up to Airport Road? Because right now, if it isn't the development that is on there, I don't have problem with the boat storage that's going up right now, because it's at least going to look nice. But there's a couple of junkyards right there. And if you look at this map, that's Triguero property right there. It's a perfect site for a restaurant or a hotel with views of the bridge and the water. And I think there's a Dutra office there, but in the meantime, there is a junkyard. He just stores used vehicles and broken down RVs there. If that whole area was designated waterfront or potential waterfront development, seems like the city could require some cleanup along there at the very least. Because extending it down to where the homes are, and then there's the marina, and then there's the Army base. I mean, extending it all the way to Sandy Beach, well, you're not going to get rid of all the residential area in there. You won't get rid of the marina. The marina is a great use, but it's not ripe for development like these areas are, is all I'm saying. So it'd be nice if that was included up there.
So let's go ahead and look at the next one, because this is where it gets real interesting.
Okay.
This is the industrial area I believe you were just discussing.
Yeah.
So extending north from the bridge, and the edge of this district does align with Airport Road, I believe. A little hard to see, but I'm pretty sure that that's Airport Road right at the top corner. Nick, want to walk us through?
Sure. So area that we're showing in the yellow boundaries is about 100 acres in size. This would be opportunity to expand the downtown area with more commercial, residential development, and mixed use. As we talked about in the last area, it could also provide additional open space, public space for outdoor events and community gatherings. Next slide. However, the constraints in the areas, there are quite a bit of existing industrial uses, which then would become non-conforming if the general plan zoning changes to perhaps downtown waterfront, because then it would have an allowing for commercial, residential, more of those uses that you'd find in the downtown area. So those existing industrial uses would then become non-conforming. Would have to reconcile that moving forward. As we had seen with the other sites or areas, potential flooding is of concern over time. But this area is such an asset and has so much potential. We've talked about it in community meetings, mostly every general plan working group meeting, this waterfront industrial area comes up.
Yeah.
Moving forward, you may want to go ahead and move forward with looking at that as designating it as downtown waterfront.
As Nick mentioned, there are industrial uses in this area. Some of them involve a level of improvement. Some actually have very little site improvement. So we aren't talking buildings that are worth millions of dollars. To my knowledge, I don't believe that any of the industrial uses in this area are dependent on river access. And that's a big difference. So these are probably businesses that could relocate if they saw the value of that. Now, keep in mind that we could change all of this to downtown waterfront, and we could say that industrial uses aren't allowed, but the industrial uses that are there would be legal non-conforming, and they could continue. We don't currently have a mechanism to make uses like that go away. We would just be opening up possibilities for different uses, and hopefully the economics would drive that the value of this ground, it just has so much greater value in retail, commercial, even housing uses than it does in its current relatively low level of industrial use. If we go down this path, and I've got to think people were thinking about this 20 years ago, but we didn't make the change. We left it as industrial. And so now we have had the executive vote in RV use, which is under construction, and the Superior Storage, which fronts up to St. Francis. Those projects are approved and they're going. So, and I'll tell you, storage uses never go away. They're really lucrative. They're really easy to maintain, and they won't go away. So we're going to have to live with those. The question is, are we comfortable with more uses of that nature moving into this area? Because this is the time. If this is going to be a difficult discussion, possibly with some property owners, and we will have to engage those property owners. But we're asking now to the group, should we start down this road of considering redesignating what is now light industrial to some other downtown commercial mixed use, not yet determined, but something not industrial. So that's the ask.
Can I ask Tom a question? Do you remember this from 20 years ago? What was discussed about this area?
You know, I don't think there's enough attention paid to it. I think there's a lot of focus on what was going on the other side of the bridge. And this was kind of like, well, these are jobs to the community. And so I don't think this was looked at a lot at that in the last general plan.
Thank you.
They can comment.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. So I don't think we should look at this waterfront industrial as one big piece and say, well, it's either they're going to be this or that. seems to me that we're looking at the waterfront area as a separate zone, if you will, and that we should define it that way. And the reason why I feel strongly that it should be changed along the waterfront is that by doing so, it would seem to me as well that when new businesses do come in, we'll have better access from St. Francis. We always talk about having connectivity between the north and the south side. And I see the best solution as of now is underneath our bridge to the promenade. And so we need to have access coming from St. Francis all the way down to the riverfront, and then pathway systems going underneath the bridge. So we're avoiding Highway 12 altogether. So I see it as being a sliver, not the entire, that entire region being, or that zone being changed. I don't know how other people
And
feel.
in that scenario, the balance of the land could stay as industrial.
Correct.
When you say a sliver, what,
Well, I
how
mean,
far back from the river are you talking?
that I
necessarily?
don't, I just see it as we shouldn't take that whole block and just say, well, we're gonna switch that to riverfront zoning or riverfront property. I mean, because it's not. I mean, when you talk about St. Francis, that's quite a distance away from the river.
Okay.
So no, I haven't defined it. I just think that we don't have to look at it as one large block.
We have the other issue too, that River Road is a Caltrans right away there. So there's not insignificant constraints that have to do with that. But I see this area as, kind of for the general plan period, that it's kind of a transitional kind of period for this area. So maybe there's aspects of, the intention of the other waterfront areas that we're trying to overlay onto this now, but acknowledge that in the short term, at least, that those industrial uses are likely not going away. But somehow to look at it, that any new development that goes on there, consider that maybe there's a certain amount of an easement along the front that should be a public access easement that kind of aligns it more with the kind of the promenade and connecting it to the town proper. So, kind of having that kind of overriding vision on this with the direction that it's going. I just think it might be a little overly aggressive if we just brought it specifically into the land use that we're talking about for the waterfront in the downtown area.
Any member Duke has her hand raised, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead, Lisa.
Hi, if I'm understanding this correctly, so that in that section there, that in this waterfront industrial, right in the middle is where the RV storage and the storage sheds are, correct? Runs from the waterfront back to St. Francis, correct? That
Yes.
middle swath,
Yes.
which, I wasn't around, when that was all voted on and approved, but it's just, to me, that's just horrible use of that land, and it was really sad. And I understand it brings in money and it's easy to maintain, and but to have that happen to any other land along that area, I think would just be, I don't know what we could do to keep that from happening, but it shouldn't have happened in the first place. So if any of that land could be maintained to or zoned so that that mistake doesn't happen. I shouldn't call it a mistake, but I think it's horrible. So
It's a lost opportunity, really, in my opinion.
that was a big mistake. And so I don't know what we could do to keep that from happening on any other waterfront property, but we need to do whatever we can to make that, to keep that from happening. Just my 2 cents here.
I think if you do something like similar, to what Edwin is talking about, you maybe somehow pick and choose the areas along there and make them a part of that waterfront. And does the designation have to be downtown waterfront, or could it just be city waterfront? And that opens you up to take in that whole waterfront area for the whole city limit, north to south. But I'm like, I agree. You're not going to run those industrial places out of there. What is it, ASTA? I don't see them ever moving. They seem to have a pretty permanent, location there. Some of the other smaller ones, possibly you could entice them to move. I don't know about that Lindsay. They seem to be pretty well entrenched there. I don't know if they would move, but there are some little pieces of land still along there that could be developed as nice waterfront properties.
Yeah, and again, this is a vision piece, meaning we're talking 20 years down the line. These businesses, it's legal non-conforming, so they're going to stay there. And I don't have a problem with that. I'm not anti-business and kicking people out. But as the properties turn over, they should be conforming to a new standard.
A couple of observations. We've been using the term downtown waterfront because that is a designation within the general plan. Downtown waterfront allows housing, commercial, retail, the whole use. So it probably is better to be thought of as mixed use that allows both commercial and residential. The name downtown waterfront maybe carrying some connotations. But, we just use that term because it's used in the general plan. So I think what we're hearing now it sounds like a majority of the working group is the waterfront is the most critical resource. The ability for people to move and walk along the waterfront is critical. But converting this entire block to some type of commercial mixed use, whatever, I'm thinking in those terms, that does not feel appropriate. Am I getting that right? I've heard that clearly from Councilmember Okamura, but I'd like a little more input. Is that where we're at?
Yeah, I agree.
And is that maybe splitting it down the middle, leaving the land towards St. Francis in the industrial designation, the land on, I don't know if we're talking about 100 feet, 1,000 feet, or what are we thinking about here?
So is there that flexibility to cut this rectangle in half and make the part from the middle to St. Francis, the light industrial, and then the other half riverfront?
Absolutely.
Do we know the width of our waterfront specific plan or the waterfront, downtown waterfront? I mean, that seems like a reasonable amount of land to fall in.
We can see
the
in
width
this
of it.
image, this is the area designated in the waterfront specific plan. But honestly, I think this was more delineated based upon the lands that aren't really fully developed or aren't developed in highest and best use for the most part. Of course, the Chevrolet dealership is in there. That's a very highly developed site, but a lot of the other lands in there are not as highly developed. So now I'm going to click on to the next one. So what we're seeing is that the land next to the bridge in this, what we call waterfront industrial district, is in fact a little bit wider than the widest part of our waterfront in the downtown area. So that probably is the best gauge for, from perception. You have a sense of that width. I'm going to just guess that we're talking 400 feet or so depth. And
500 probably or so.
you want to give us a measurement, Nick?
Well, I'm kind of guesstimating as well, just based off of the roads and other things I'm looking at. Yeah, it's probably no more than 500 feet or so from edge to edge.
Stop guessing.
On the other side of the south side of the bridge, you could probably just use Front Street as the
St.
boundary.
Francis to the river is 1,500 feet. Okay, so at the widest there, it's 1,500 feet. So splitting it down the middle, it's around 750.
Roughly 500 from
Yeah,
that first
500.
cutout over there.
Yeah,
Mhm.
approximately.
Yeah. I mean, I don't really have a preference. I mean, I'm thinking more from the perspective of if a developer would have come in and say, I want to put in mixed use, and then he says, well, this amount of land isn't sufficient, or it is, or it's plenty of room. I don't have any idea, quite
What I
frankly.
would ask is, I think I'm hearing a coalescing around this idea of some commercial mixed-use waterfront, some light industrial. Let us ponder a little bit what would be a developable chunk of land, because if you get too narrow, you simply can't develop it, and we haven't done it yet. So, but I think we get the concept, and let us work with it, and we'll come back with a recommendation of how we should kind of split between industrial and the commercial designation.
Well, and I guess I would like to have some input, because I would actually be to expand that box more in line with what Lisa Duke was saying, that maybe to have that yellow line come clear down St. Francis essentially, and then cut behind that trailer park down to the bridge. That little loop that's right to the north of the bridge isn't in waterfront industrial, nor is it in the downtown waterfront designation. So I'd love to know what that is. But I think that if that's such a nice bluff, that I would wonder if you could do mixed use, and you're going to look into that maybe having it actually be kept from access potential from St. Francis as well as from the waterfront, that would actually be of greater interest to a developer for mixed use designation, since there's a nice sand pit in there off of Asta. You've got the storage going in. Again, they would be non-compliant, but allow for other pieces to go in that bluff and rise to St. Francis that would allow you to access and use the waterfront as well as access off of St. Francis or River Road.
Lots to think about now.
What is that other little narrow strip there just south
other
of
side of
the
the
base? Yeah, what is that?
I'm
Or
looking at it.
who owns that?
That's the Triguero Trust, and that's flood
Oh,
all the way clear to
Yeah,
the river.
that's serious floodplain right
Oh,
there.
it's like a drainage canal or.
To the east of the ballpark, those are light industrial buildings.
That's Dutra.
Okay, Nick, we have a little more work to do on this one.
Yeah, definitely.
But what we didn't hear was it's okay as industrial. So we do understand the waterfront is the highest and most important asset, and that public access is important, and that having a unit of land that could be developed for commercial uses in conjunction with waterfront is important. So we want to think in terms of what's the minimum developable unit of land. I am curious, now I heard that the land immediately west of the ball fields is flooding. It doesn't, is that a, I'm not, it doesn't look like a channel in the area.
I'm sorry, I'm talking south. I mean, again, you're talking at noontime about it. We're not really north-south, but it's to the south of the ballpark, that little strip going down to the river, that's flood.
Yeah, if
It
you,
is.
if you go on the other side of St. Francis, all up above there, there's a reason why that's the edge of town, and there's nothing built there between that and the, the public works area there, because that's all part of a larger drainage swale that actually comes all the way around the city from Highway 12.
Okay. All right. 'Cause I was just seeing open ground that could be developed. Right. I think we have good direction on this one, enough to come back. This is one of the more interesting properties, and probably the next one is similar. And then now we've headed upstream to the final property that is within the city. Nick?
Yeah, so this area, which is identified as existing study area in the general plan, which is a little confusing because there's not much in there regarding about this site. So it will be interesting to see your thoughts. Maybe you have some extra information you can share with us. So this area, just north of the site we were looking at, this one is 65 acres in area. There is potential infill and redevelopment here with new uses along the waterfront. But the longer term transition of uses would likely occur. And river dependent industrial that's there today, particularly in the northern section of this area, may be appropriate as long-term uses because they are more tied to the river from what we're seeing. But maybe the area to the south could see more potential infill or redevelopment occurring over time. So next slide. Again, we're seeing some of the same constraints as we have along all the other properties along the waterfront, with being in the 100-year flood zone and potential for increased flooding over time. And that's kind of the constraints we see now for this area. But in terms of a recommendation, we see identifying river dependent industrial uses in the general plan and consider retaining those because they are important to the community and they are dependent upon the river, and would need to really talk with local landowners and affected landowners in the area and initiate some discussions about the future of those properties and how it ties into the overall vision of the waterfront over the next 20 years. And yeah, I think that's it for this slide. If you want to go back, Paul.
So we initially looked at this and thought, how about just a continuation of the waterfront downtown uses? And as we considered it, first of all, we had some concern that we have industrial uses that simply can't be relocated. They have barge, they have dredging, they have, you know, that's a different use. You can't say, would you mind moving to the other side of St. Francis? So that was a consideration. And also, this area is all within the 100-year floodplain right now. And we really should have some understanding about the likelihood of getting this land out of the floodplain and whether that's feasible in any of the scenarios that we see coming. If it is, then that really changes the complexion of what could happen. But we're less enthusiastic about going for cafes and hotels on this property, shall we say. So we're interested in what the group can share with your knowledge of the community, the property. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, this is where the original city of Rio Vista was. And yeah, the whole town was moved down the river to get to higher ground because there were just consistent flooding problems that happened. I think it was probably 1890s or so when the city moved from this area.
Okay.
You may possibly extend the waterfront piece into that a little bit, but you're not going to be able to go very far because you're going to start running into all those industrial, you know, those river industrial companies. And I don't know that you'll ever get those people out of there. Ollie, what owns the biggest chunk of that land up that way?
But yeah, there are several residences along their homes, and I think there's a small trailer park that's up along in that area too. So
Right.
that kind of that first, maybe third along the waterfront there already is a residential use.
Thoughts? This is designated study area, but there's not much guidance in the general plan as far as what we're studying. So we don't really understand what the expectation was here. Currently, it's being used as construction staging, barge, river-related construction. I think immediately to the I don't know, northwest. There's some large aggregate piles. And it appears that some of those aggregate piles may be 6 or 8 feet high. So there's a large amount of material being stockpiled. That may be the appropriate use for property like this and the constraints. Is this an area we should be looking at, or do we just let it sit as it is? What are the thoughts on this?
I think there may be some opportunity, at least looking along the airport road frontage area there to kind of tie it in with some of the other stuff that we hope goes on. So I think that's a possibility. And then, as I said, we already have residential uses that are happening both along the river frontage, and then there's a couple of apartment buildings that go from the airport road corner kind of up toward the ferry there too. So there's existing residential that's occurring there.
So are we familiar with the zone? I mean, I assume that that little strip on the water is all zoned as residential.
I believe it's zone CS1 or some obscure designation. I actually looked it up on the zoning map. I can look at it. right now.
Okay. Yeah, it might make sense. I like Tom's idea of having it be like almost a little L there from St. Francis down to the River Road and then up just a little notch where to include those residences that are there. And then when people are driving down Airport Road, it'd be a nice feel as you're driving down on both sides of the road.
So it gobbles up that little V part.
That, yes,
Yeah.
right.
The sharp tail. Interestingly, there's a dense little, it appears to be manufactured housing units. Yeah. Yeah. I want to live in that mobile home park on the river. That's pretty cool.
Careful what you wish for.
Fair enough. So I'm not hearing a lot of appetite to think about the more northern portions of this. And we have some existing residents just,
It seems like they're entrenched with the industrial part of that. And I think that's what we sound like we're struggling with.
okay. Because of the way the uses are developed, this does not appear to be a good candidate for public access right along the water. The uses go right down to the water, so.
Yeah, and it really seems to me that somewhere in our town, we should have commercial along the water. We used to be a port city, right, with asparagus being transported out of here. So I don't think we should lose those routes completely.
Some of the light industrial in the previous segment be moved into this part?
As far as the river oriented or just the
well-
light industrial in general?
Just some of the light industrial that we would like to get out of the lower.
I think we have better candidate sites for that,
Okay.
actually. I think as we move up Airport Road, there's some lands we should be looking at to open up for industrial uses.
Okay.
That would be good candidates away from the water and also away from homes. Nick, do you have a sense of where we're going on this one?
It appears we will likely retain a good portion of it, at least the southern part, and keep it maintained as residential. And perhaps the upper part would be some type of industrial classification, whether it's limited or general. Seems like it's probably more general related industrial. But in terms of the general plan, it is a bit different than zoning. So we can be a little more creative and have a category or designation that would allow a lot of different uses. And it's not to say that the zoning couldn't allow, residential to occur. And some of these other types of things we're looking at. So we don't necessarily have to slice it and dice it into like 3 different general plan designations. It could be, perhaps 1 or 2. So I think we just still need to study this a little bit more and look at the opportunities here with the constraints, particularly, the challenges we've been talking about the last few minutes. Does that, in terms of,
Again, Nick?
in terms of the general plan designation, we could have something that, if it allows several different uses, it may actually cover more of the property or the area than we're talking about now. Because, several things could be allowed within that category.
Okay. This one's going to need a little more work to refine. It's quite a mishmash, and we will look at uses as well as zoning. There is a block of residentially zoned land that takes in those modulars, and there's some very quaint cottages on the other side of the river. So we'll be taking a look at that, but those may transition over to a residential designation since they are residential uses. Okay, moving along. Nick, our first potential industrial area.
Right, so this area that we're showing in yellow is currently in the sphere of influence. This matches the boundaries of the sphere of influence today. This area is about 230 acres in size and mostly undeveloped today. I think there's just a little bit of development to the south there, but this would provide an area for relocation of industry along the waterfront, a potential area to relocate those industrial uses we were just talking about. And we think it's a good spot because it is in close proximity to an existing industrial uses today along Airport Road. Now, some of this, turned industrial, perhaps some of it is retained as natural or open space towards the top, but this would, in terms of constraints, require some annexation to occur for those properties within this area. And then part of the site is subject to flooding from what we saw earlier on the constraints map. Next slide. So in terms of this property or area moving forward, we'd have to evaluate flooding environmental constraints and have that in consideration as we designate the area. But we are considering designating this as industrial employment limited or industrial employment general. And also we'd have to talk with affected landowners moving forward and talk, how their thoughts would be about being annexed into the city, and also the types of industrial uses. Does this make sense here to include perhaps one of the categories, industrial employment limited, which is more of the light industrial we were talking about earlier, or industrial employment general, which would be more of those heavier industrial uses. So quite a bit to consider in this one, but want to get your thoughts and your ideas.
One thought I had looking at it here, we have the area that was the former dumps that's not included within this boundary here. I don't know if there's been any determination of that at this point, if the dumps have been shut down long enough for that to be potentially buildable, or if that's still a zone that we can't really do anything with.
Can you clarify where the former dump was? I'm not familiar.
Yeah, it was the city dumps. Basically, it's the square area that's next to the storage facility. I mean, it's between the storage facility and where these yellow line designations
So
are.
it's to the river side of the storage.
Yes,
Okay.
correct. So yeah, that's the area. And I can't tell you exactly when the dumps were shut down, but it was probably sometime around the 1980s.
When we're talking about industrial, does that eliminate, and can you squeeze some retail into that as well? What I'm getting at is.
You want to move?
Yeah. But what I'm getting at is, I think it would be a mistake to just think of airport as solely industrial. It's pretty high traffic. And I think, especially as we expand out with Liberty and Brand Ranch, just getting more and more traffic that we could open up for some retail possibilities out there as well.
We can certainly consider what we're doing here is trying to vision for the future. And if straight industrial doesn't really meet the goal or the vision, we can implement something that would allow more mixed use.
Does part of this area flood? Is that what I heard earlier? And then what part of it does flood?
Nick, are you familiar enough, or would you like me to go back to the flood map?
Yeah, please. Yeah, so we can take a look.
Okay. It's a little ways back, but there it is. So it looks like the corner that's, the southeast corner is subject to flooding right now. Clarified?
Yes. So following the same theme that Tom had mentioned, and we agreed upon the airport road as you're approaching, it would tie in nicely to the rest of Rio Vista, where we were going to put mixed use or residential in that L. Could we not extend that all the way up toward, I don't know what street that is, basically where the dump is, and continue that L a strip all the way up there. And that way, as new developers come in, they could put it on that side, and it would, in essence, hide the general industrial or industrial on the other side. That makes sense?
I'm not sure where
I didn't quite.
you are.
Yeah, so along Airport Road, we had talked about the past zone. We had just finished on that, and we had talked about an L all the way from St. Francis all the way down to River Road, and then that little strip of residential. That was all going to be zoned potentially differently, right? It's a different study area, right?
Okay.
And then so there you would just continue to extend it all the way up the arm of the L along Airport Road.
So maybe a 200-foot wide swath from Airport Road pulling.
Right,
Is
all
that
the
what
way
we're-
down, basically the same width as down below in the zone below
That
it.
undeveloped property that we see.
Right.
So you want to include airport storage?
Is that airport storage?
Yeah.
Yes, it would be a legal non-conforming. Potentially, I mean, it's a thought. I mean, again, I'm looking 20 years down the road. What do we want to see when we're driving up or down Airport Road? Do we just want to see a bunch of industrial buildings, or we'd like to see? That's the question. What would we like to see?
Does it make sense then, Edwin, to maybe even extend that, if not all the way to Church, beyond to the place where we would be able to build around the airport? A similar strip, like you're saying, all the way from that waterfront, that same strip, all the way along Airport, beyond Church, out to the.
Right. I mean, I think one of the things we're always talking about is what is our population going to potentially cap out at? And I've heard anything from 17,000 to 20,000. Or if we're looking for land that could be used for residential, it seemed like this would be potentially good land, assuming we could deal with the flood issues. And actually, that good portion of that is an inflood.
Here's that undeveloped strip that's just outside of this study area is about 300 feet wide. That's what we're talking about, is kind of carrying that 300-foot strip up at least to the storage facility, or maybe beyond the storage facility. I'm not clear.
Well, I think Tom was suggesting that should be brought into it, correct, Tom? The area, although that yellow line should be extended up to include the dump, the former dump. Was that the suggestion? And if so, then yes, I would say extend it all the way to the edge of the storage facility.
Yeah, I mean, if we determine that the former dump site is buildable, I don't see any reason why we wouldn't extend the yellow line up. So it's just kind of a wider straight down from the top corner all the way down to Airport Road.
And our general plan's
Yeah.
not dealing with remediation or anything like that. I mean, there's remediation issues down on the Army base as well. So it seems to me it should be in it.
I think as you'll see at the end, when you really pull back a little bit, that line is following the city limits and the sphere of influence. It's kind of an artificial line. It doesn't really mean anything ultimately. What we're seeing is there's really a strip of development that extends from close to the river up to the airport. And that's the industrial potential, but maybe now we're talking about industrial with some kind of residential setback on Airport Road. Am I getting that right, Edwin? We're really talking about maybe there would be an opportunity for residential east of Airport Road.
Potentially, yeah.
Okay, all right,
Or commercial, as Rick was talking about,
commercial, okay.
Mhm.
mixed
right.
use.
Okay, but something different on Airport Road. We don't have to line Airport Road with industrial uses. Okay. That's actually making a lot of sense, because we are contemplating residential on the other side of Airport Road on city-owned property. So that some type of transition use would complement that. Nick, are you following all this?
I am. I'm writing a lot of notes. So that's why I'm a little quiet. Try to get this down.
Excellent. Great. I think I have a good understanding, at least enough to go the next level on these graphics. Now we're going to continue along on our journey. And this is across Airport Road from the storage use that we've called this the city 50-acre property ever since I've been here, and it's actually 65 acres. So I don't know why we started calling it the 50-acre property, but anyway. Nick?
Yeah, so opportunities for the site. Actually, before I get into opportunities, this area has been looked at with a grant opportunity. I think we mentioned this at the beginning of the general plan update process, but we do have a grant from the state to look at this property in more detail for potential new residential development and do some conceptual site planning to look at a broad range of housing types on the site that could provide some, different housing options for residents and new residents to come into the city. So we are looking at this in a little bit of detail with new housing, perhaps some community park space, neighborhood park space as a part of it. So that is a separate exercise we are going to be working on, looking at this in more detail. But for the general plan, in terms of the opportunities that what I just mentioned are there for residential, since it is next to existing residential, just to the south and to the northwest. But in terms of constraints, we don't really see too much there in terms of constraints. It's a great piece of land along Airport Road, and it has a lot of good assets to it in terms of its location, and opportunity for new development there for residential makes a lot of sense. Next slide. And we would like to reclassify this just as an idea from industrial employment, which it is designated today in the general plan, to a neighborhood service mixed use district, which would allow for more medium density housing that we would be looking at. So perhaps, townhomes, greater than 10 dwelling units an acre. It could be some apartments on that site, perhaps, one end of it. But there could also be some single family. So it would be a mix of residential and uses that would be a little bit different than the neighborhood residential that we were looking at in some of the other properties in the city. This would just definitely allow some opportunities to do some different things here, but it would mostly be residential with some commercial, not likely commercial, but community park space, neighborhood park space that would allow an opportunity for other residents of the city to use on that site.
As Nick mentioned, we did receive a grant to study this property for development as residential uses. We have not made a firm commitment to rezone it, but rezoning has certain advantages. This is actually property that could be developed and without constraints, without limitations from landowners, any of those challenges we're facing on other properties. We have been contemplating this for approximately 5 acres of higher density housing, because we do need to identify ways that we will meet future higher density, lower income housing obligations. Regional housing needs assessment, or RHNA, will dictate over time that we have to find more higher density housing sites. So while not immediately needed, this would put us in a good position for the next housing element cycle. So there's some benefit there. And there is the advantage that as the owner of the property, we can really dictate the form and say, this is what we expect. And this is the form of housing that we think works for the city of Rio Vista. So it's nice to have that kind of leverage in a project. But again, there's been no commitment. We haven't promised anybody that we're going to rezone this to residential, but that is what we're studying, and we'll be bringing plans forward. If this group thinks that all makes sense, that does kind of just validate that we're going in the right direction.
Does a mixed use incorporate some of what Rick was talking about, where you might have retail on your first floor and then housing above it? If you're talking about high density, that there might even be like a community park, et cetera, but you would be able to have small shops, living apartments above it. Is that mixed use as well?
That is mixed use.
Okay.
And I will tell you, that's a really neat form of development, and it's not going to happen here. It's just there's economics of that construction. There's economics of commercial tenancy, getting businesses to move in. It's mixed use can work in a more, not necessarily urban, but suburban, moving towards urban. And I mean, not San Francisco, but Walnut Creek. It would be really hard to make it work here. And what we would see probably is those downstairs commercial spaces would just become part of the residence. I've just seen this happen a fair amount, so.
But it's not to say, however, live work perhaps could be an option here, where somebody does have a workspace on the ground floor of their building. That's been happening more and more in the state. Could be unlikely here. Maybe that's more geared towards the waterfront district and the downtown district, but that could perhaps happen. Within this general plan designation neighborhood service mixed use, it does allow creativity of uses and mix of uses, but we are utilizing.
Nick, this designation would allow the commercial, right? It allows
a minimal amount, not a lot, but it would allow like 10% site or 15%, I believe.
So that option would be there. And Nick does bring up an interesting form of housing, which is live work, where maybe an artist has workspace and we let them have a commercial business, but it's not retail driven, which is more what I was thinking of. Is the retail driven is just, it's a very challenging market. Retail commercial uses now, particularly with what's happened with e-commerce and all the challenges, and the fact that we want to drive people to downtown. There's just, we have to think about a lot of factors.
I think the reason why I was asking is because the comments that are happening in the community where airport is becoming the workaround for 12. So if you were thinking about putting a retail or something that would be attractive there, it might bifurcate certainly the city. It might also increase a connection because now you've got people coming down airport to at least get services there and then thinking about maybe coming on around. I completely understand what you're saying though about the economics, and that would not have been something that I was aware of. So I can appreciate that.
So I think we've heard the idea of alternate uses fronting to airport, certainly on the storage side, maybe on this side as well. So we'll play with that and keep open to those concepts.
Paul, can you go back to the map for a second, please? That notch in there, is that property what was recently just subdivided? And isn't he going to build something on that little notch?
The notch is John Grimma's property.
Okay.
That represents 5 acres. Mr. Grimm is only interested in developing 2 acres and is interested in selling the remaining 3.
And what's he going to develop the 2 acres into?
He has an extensive automobile collection,
Oh, that's right.
and
Okay.
the structure would be to store his own personal automobiles. One thing that we didn't touch on is there's a second yellow box there. That property has approached the city saying, we would like to develop as residential. And it's a really intriguing opportunity because right now we have a disconnect from Harris Road in any way getting to downtown. And this opens up some interesting possibilities for both vehicular connection down Harris Road into the business park, but even more so also for bike ped connections that we can get folks down to the business park and then start working them over to some pedestrian route that would probably go across the Cino property and provide a route downtown. And that's one way we could start to knit together some of these parts of the community that right now are disconnected. So having that extra 5 acres in play is offering us some interesting opportunities. It is nestled right into Homecoming, so residential there is probably more desirable than additional industrial.
And that was the comment I was going to make, is this is really a key property for tying together that kind of bicycle pedestrian pathway. And if we're talking about something that might be a more dense kind of residential use here, anything that's, safe passage to get the kids to school, it's proximity to DH White and such. So I think that's something that's just really important to keep in mind. We have the great wide pedestrian path that stops at the end of the trilogy project there, but just kind of extending that. So we have that kind of a nice broad path that could be mixed for pedestrians and bikes.
Okay, so number 6, how about number 7? We've already had a good observation that this area is extending into overflight zones, and so we're going to have to look at the restrictions of the airport. Nick, you want to walk us through this?
Yeah, so this area in yellow is about 136 acres in size. It is another opportunity area for relocating some industrial uses. If we do reclassify that as waterfront downtown area. It would also be great to have some of these industrial uses clustered around the airport where existing industrial is today. There are some constraints for this property. Just obviously with the airport in close proximity, there is current designated agricultural land open space here. This is how it's designated in the general plan, this property. So it would require changing it to an industrial designation. There are on-site wetlands here in this area. Although we are trying to avoid that there with the way we drew the line in terms of how it's curving near the top. Initially, before we were kind of looking at the area in detail, we were kind of expanding it a little bit more towards the airport, but then we curtailed it a bit so we could avoid that water body there, wetlands feature. And the treatment plant, this is where that is today. And we would like to have some thoughts on the treatment plant and how that's being used and perhaps the future of that property and that use. And how that could play into industrial being incorporated into the area.
And to the extent any of the members of the group can share thoughts on the treatment plant, we'll also be working with Public Works. I mean, there's lots of issues associated with a key infrastructure, including odor, security, lots to think about, access, hazards and such. But if the group, if anybody on the group, and I know we have council members who might have some specific knowledge, if you say, boy, that's a really bad idea to put anything near our treatment plant, just tell us now and we'll back off. But it looked like some open ground that was worth thinking about.
Didn't you want to live at the river at one point and maybe we can move you here? Just a thought. Sorry.
Oh,
I don't know anybody that would want to live around there, so I can't see it changing from industrial. I mean,
Well,
Well, I
I
think-
I think the question is whether it's even truly an opportunity site for industrial, or whether we should just anticipate leaving vacant land around the treatment plant. And I don't yet understand what that water body is, if that's related to some type of disposal. Is that treated effluent that's heading out there? I don't know why that body of water's there, so. But we have a lot to figure out about this property. It presents, there's a total of 136 acres. There's enough land there to be interesting, but this site looks like it has some real constraints.
I believe also this area is one of the few areas in the city limits that is designated as agricultural land, open space, or at least a significant area. In the land use map, when you want to take a look later, but it is interesting. This is designated as agriculture open space and does provide an area for conservation, today. So.
So any thoughts?
unlimited supply of fertilizer. I don't know.
I guess my thought is and I'm no expert on wastewater, but it seems, I mean, I've heard that security is a big issue around them. So it would seem to me that you would cut off that top of that section around it and have a setback away, and then the rest, yeah, I guess I'm silent on. I don't really have much opinion. Somebody had once suggested, well, why, if there's a lot of open space there, why don't you turn it into parkland? I don't really have much of opinion.
You've already got the pot, dispensaries and what have you, and grow houses in the industrial area, so.
So you're saying that they make this smell better?
But they might.
But
But I mean, you got,
I'm
the
not
two
registering
locations.
a lot of enthusiasm, and we of course have some concerns. So we'll look at this with some level of interest, but this doesn't appear to be really the solution for additional sites for our, our industrial, we hope will relocate from the river.
What about the areas immediately off of Church right
Yeah.
there? I mean, I'm just talking the first couple 100 feet,
Mhm.
just carving that out.
Immediately off of Church, or why not immediately off of
Sorry,
Airport?
That's what
Yeah.
I meant.
Yeah,
is
okay,
airport, I'm
yeah.
sorry.
Just leave the treatment plant kind of isolated
Yeah.
to itself.
Yeah.
So focus on the frontage and,
Mhm.
okay.
Yeah.
Paul, what do other cities do with the area around a sewer plant like that? Sewage.
Out in the middle of nowhere usually.
Lots of different solutions, ideally separated, well separated, but not always. You will see wastewater treatment plants inside cities, obviously.
Mhm.
So a lot of it has to do with how it's operated, and different treatment plants do their operations generate more or less odors. So that's the big concern aside from safety. Just as a key piece of infrastructure, we need to make sure it's secure.
Which is the actual wastewater plant? Is it the one closest to airport or?
No, it's
farther
the
back?
setback.
The setback one?
Okay, I think we've got enough on that one. Brand Ranch.
Grand Ranch, an opportunity site, about 311 acres in size, just north of the airport, or is it? No, well, really west of the airport, actually. I'm kind of turned around here. In terms of opportunities, there is an approved development plan, which we'll show in just a moment, for the property that shows housing, recreation areas and parks, a proposed school, as well as some neighborhood commercial that would serve the new community of Brand Ranch and the outlying areas there. There are some constraints in terms of, as we showed earlier, some of the property is restricted by floodplain, as well as being constricted by the airport with the flight zone. So that area is being designated in the plan for park space and for other uses, not residential, since it is under the flight path. Next slide. So here, as you can see, there's lotting of the Brand Ranch property into residential. I think there's about 3 different categories of single family, or a bit different intensities in terms of lot sizes. There is the green space and the park space, I believe in blue, and then the commercial space are showing in the purple there to the, kind of lined up in the middle of the site under the flight path. So this provides some opportunities for other uses in the neighborhood or the district. This is a few years old too, I believe. This is about, Paul, can you provide us the information on that? Is that a little over 10 years old, that plan?
Yeah, a little more than 10 years. That is the originally approved or currently approved Brand Ranch plan. Project was originally approved, I believe, in the 90s. It goes way back. The current owners of Brand Ranch have approached the city and are interested in considering somewhat higher density residential development, but still pretty much in keeping with the character of the project, which is mostly residential, mostly single family, a mix of public uses, some commercial. I think the current applicants would probably like to see less commercial than was proposed. And I got to tell you, it looks like it had too much commercial to me, just kind of squinting the eyes. I don't know who's going out there to go shopping in Brand Ranch. So I think that there might be some value in a redesign of Brand Ranch, but that really is up to the property owners to propose. I think what we're seeing is a project that really does want to be mostly residential. Its location is such that makes sense. It probably is not going to support a substantial amount of commercial or employment uses. It's really getting out to the edge of town, whereas we want to be focusing that energy in downtown. So probably the designation for Brand Ranch is, Nick, what is it designated now? Neighborhood residential, which does allow for some mix of uses, both in density of residential as well as some non-residential uses. That's probably a good designation for purposes of the general plan. The developers are currently working with the school district and will have to reconcile their obligation with the school district. And that's a discussion that's going to happen between the developers and the district. And any redesign of Brand Ranch would then have to come back for city consideration. I don't think there's a lot to do with this project in the general plan. I think that by its character of mostly residential with some ancillary public or possibly commercial uses makes sense. The current designation or the designation of neighborhood residential would accommodate that. And I think we can just let the developers sort out what they think is feasible. And then the project would go through the city review process at that time. So I don't think there's too much we need to do on this project now. Any questions? Sino property. I was asked this afternoon to stop calling it Riverwalk. There's no river. And so everybody knows it as the Sino property. So we'll call it that. Nick?
Okay, so this area is about 200 acres in size. Definitely some opportunities here. It's a great piece of property right in the middle of the city and could be a great connection from the north to the south in many different ways, and kind of fill in the puzzle piece of land and available land for new housing and other opportunities. So infill development, likely with single family residential that could be close to downtown, with open space and neighborhood parks as a part of that, as well as providing some connections from the northern part of the city to downtown with a trail system that could go through that would be a great opportunity moving forward. However, there are a bit of constraints with the natural gas facilities on the site and how it would be developed over time. Next slide. So in terms of the Sino property moving forward, thinking of maintaining it as predominantly residential would make sense, and not necessarily a mix of uses, but mostly just residential based on its location. And also, we would need to review the status of the project approvals, where they are now, and whether some plan modifications are desired for the location of the residential areas and neighborhood parks and other things. So we do have a site plan we can show on the next slide. If some of you aren't familiar with this, this is the vesting tentative map for the property, showing mostly residential here and then some space for parks and conservation area, but mostly would be developed as single family residential according to the plan that's there today. That's not to say we can't talk to the developer or property owner about changing the site plan a bit, looking at a mix of residential types, because it looks very similar. All the lots are about the same size. There's not much creativity here in the way it's laid out. So there could be some potential for redesign.
So there is also a couple of areas that are designated for higher density housing and for commercial that are at Church and Highway 12. That's the lower left corner of that plan. I also believe, and I'm trying to confirm because I don't want to state this as a determination yet, but I'm pretty sure that the DA for Riverwalk has expired. As far as I can tell, looking at the dates, it appears that it expired. With it, this vesting tentative map expired. And so that means that we're no longer required to adhere to this land plan. So we do have flexibility as a city. When this project comes back to the city, I believe that we'll have the latitude to talk about redesigning. There's some key trail corridors that I'd love to see across this property. There's some, as Nick mentioned, it's fairly uniform in its type of development and the way it's laid out. It could easily be more mixed and more interesting. So there's some ways that this project could be enhanced, but keep in mind its location. This is the project that will knit the city together. Right now, this is what's breaking the city into two distinct areas, and this will help to create a much more unified community.
Now, we've been told, or at least I've been told on several occasions, they did successfully get an extension on the BA that, and I think there's, last I heard, 2 years left on the extension. Somewhere around
I was not able to find files that suggested that, so there must have been an extension that was not provided to me. The last extension I had, it seemed that it had lapsed. So, but it makes sense. Sino's a smart developer. They would have tried to retain rights, and so I'm not surprised to hear that. I just don't have that documentation.
And that one went through planning commission, correct? So if it did, that was years ago that they came back and asked for an extension. So they had also come and said they were going to develop the northern edge of that and put in 20 homes. And I know that expired as well. So
Well,
anyway, we have to research it.
Just a fine distinction. I don't think the DA on its own would have extended, but there was a provision that they had to record their first final map. And that was the one where I think that they missed their obligation to record a first final map. So while the DA would have gone this far, I think that by not recording a final map, that I believe was what I had read. So we should, I'd like to go over this with the attorneys and make sure, because this is, I don't want to be misrepresenting where we're at, but I think it may have lapsed because of that provision of requiring a recorded final map.
What kind of concerns me is it looks like they're adding 2 streets out into Highway 12. And we have enough problems with Church. We certainly don't need 2 more streets right onto 12. But that's obviously not a zoning thing. But
That's a very real issue, and Church and 12 is a problem already that what Caltrans is doing is not enough. It's going to be better, but it's not enough, and it's still going to be an unfortunately dangerous intersection. So
Yeah, I think one thing we need to look at here too, that corner at Highway 12 and Church is, in addition, the property across Church, that was anticipated to be kind of a major shopping area there. And if we want to continue supporting that, which could have some real ramifications on the downtown, or if we want to, try to steer it in another direction. I mean, there's obviously, a lot of services that could be helpful for the residents of Trilogy, helping them to better age in place. That I think would be a great use potentially for that area too. But yeah, it was originally anticipated this town would grow to a size where a Safeway or someone like that would want to put a supermarket in there. But I don't think that, with the constraints that we now have in the growth of the city, I'm not sure that we could ever get to the spot of drawing a big grocery store like that, and whether that would be beneficial to the city or not also.
okay, we will keep an eye on the Cino property. Probably predominantly residential makes sense. The design details, if they are open to review, I think we could come up with a better project, but probably not that much different of a project. Makes sense? Okay. And our final project, Del Rio Hills. Nick?
Yeah, this one site is about 500 acres nearly in size. The opportunities similar to the other properties, it's close location to downtown, and opportunities for new residential development can provide a mix of housing types and densities for various income levels, provisions of open space, neighborhood parks, trails, connections, et cetera, could also be incorporated within the design of this property moving forward. In terms of constraints, the natural gas sites and extraction and the infrastructure related to that is a big constraint of the property. This property, I believe, is designated 2 different residential general plan designations today. So that is something that would have to be reconciled moving forward, perhaps, or maybe we keep those and retain those, but that is something that is involved on the property today. Next slide. We did, talk about this at length, Paul and I, in our team, and we feel that reclassifying Del Rio Hills to be neighborhood residential alone and not having the 2 designations would allow still a mix of housing and some non-residential uses here. So it would be a good opportunity, to allow some different things perhaps to occur, but mostly residential would make sense on this property in terms of its location, road access, and proximity to downtown. So that's our thought.
The one caveat we would offer is at 500 acres, this is a big project.
Yeah.
If there is a desire to have some type of non-residential use, maybe that's office, medical office, something like that. I don't think we want to promote commercial necessarily, or maybe we want to have one 10-acre commercial site or so that could accommodate a grocery store. I don't think we have a location right now in the city that would accommodate a typical shopping center with a grocery store, the kind of anchor with the inline stores and that. I believe we'd be hard pressed to find that site inside Rio Vista right now. So this might be a time to think about, what makes sense. Of course, we again, much like Sino, we need to look at the entitlements for this project, what rights they have, what vested rights, where they stand, because we do not want to start making general plan designations that are inconsistent with projects that have vested protective approvals. So this is one where it is a very large project, and it might make sense to think about, should there be something along Highway 12? So just put that out there. And that's really an evolving thought, because Nick and I coming into this meeting had said, yeah, let's go neighborhood residential, that works. But having heard some of the discussions just today, the need to have some office, the need to have medical uses and such, this might be a place to think about that.
Could you go back to the map?
So is this,
It's right across the street
Well-
from Sino. And that's Church coming in
okay,
near the top of it.
and church goes all the way in there? I guess it's not called church, but near that corner.
Something goes in there. I can look. It may just be a gravel road. I'm not sure.
Paul, isn't this area filled with gas wells? And that seems to be what I have heard.
There is a lot of gas infrastructure, and I have heard that the likelihood of this developing near term is limited. I don't know where on this property, because again, 500 acres is a big piece of ground.
Mhm.
There may be portions of it that are less constrained and portions that are more constrained.
Yeah, so this is the last site of all 10 of them.
All right. Shake it off. Got through it. The rest of our discussion, and this is not going to be particularly long at this point, is a big picture. Where is Rio Vista going? Where could it go? Where can we anticipate the city going? So anticipated growth. The current general plan thought we would be at 24,000 people today. We're sitting at about 10,500. So obviously development has occurred much more slowly than was anticipated in 2002. In the periods where we've been growing, accepting the big housing downturn, we've been growing at about 3% annually, which is a healthy growth rate. It's not overly rapid, but that's a pretty steady, solid growth rate. If we hold that back over the life of this general plan and maybe anticipate on average we'll hit 2% annually over the life of the general plan, that puts us at about 17,000 people at 2045. So it gives you an idea of what we might expect from absorption, just rate of development, if there was no constraints. So the idea that we were going to be at 24,000 today was ambitious. We don't see that we'll be there in 20 years. I had been telling folks, I don't think we're going to be able to get beyond 15,000 because of the constraints, and maybe, the biggest one being Flannery. I'm not sure about that now, because we've taken a look at what is around the city, and just kind of in very big bubbles now. We've been focusing on properties, but now as we pull out and really look at the city as a whole, that industrial area, generally south and east from the airport and airport road. We think that that's really a complex of properties that will be able to provide and accommodate a fair amount of industrial growth. We think that there could be some good employment growth in there. There's a couple of ovals that are outside of Grand Ranch and north of Liberty. Those properties are not currently controlled by Flannery, so they represent opportunities. If those properties were to be interested in joining the city and develop, we could easily imagine a couple of thousand homes because those represent some pretty big blocks of land. Del Rio Hills, yeah, it's planned for what, can't really see, 1900. I need my other glasses. 1920 and 500 plus multifamily. So that's a lot of development, but we do know that there's constraints, there's gas well constraints. And so we aren't really feeling too confident about Del Rio Hills in the near term. Riverwalk Casino, that seems more likely. I mean, that's property in the city, not highly constrained. That seems like if the market is there, that's property that would come in. Brand Ranch, we know there's interest in developing it. It's pretty easy to envision maybe 5,000 dwellings out of these various projects. I could imagine if everything went exactly right, that could be 7,000, but 5,000 homes equals about 15,000 people. Rule of thumb is 3 persons per household. So that's where we got to, we might actually hit at build out. And we're now not talking about the general plan. We're talking about forever after, maybe 25,000 people in Rio Vista. So that helps us to start thinking about how many schools does a city of 25,000 need? How much shopping can it support? What type of road system do we need to support that population? So we're planning for 2045, but we're keeping our eye on the ultimate size of Rio Vista as we go through this planning process. So that's what it's looking like today. All of this may change. Probably some of this will change before we finish the general plan. So we'll be adjusting this, but as of today, this is generally what it looks like for the potential growth of Rio Vista. It's a very attractive community. You have a great quality of life. The comments we get over and over are wonderful small town. I feel safe. I enjoy living here. When I started asking people in the general plan meetings, how long have you been here? I now say, oh, you've only been here 10 years. You're a newcomer. Because we have folks, I don't know, some folks in this room who are multi-generational, right, Rick? You know, this is a community that people value, and I think those qualities will leave you in a good place. Housing in Rio Vista is relatively affordable when you compare it to the Bay Area. So the idea of commuting into the Bay Area for the quality of life and the ability to own a home, all of those factors, I think, suggest that we're going to continue to see demand for housing. So I don't think these numbers of, 17,000 in the life of the general plan and 25 ultimately, those aren't real stretch goals. Those seem reasonable.
Question.
No, go ahead.
So are there any, and you probably have the tools to do this, I think one of our goals, given what Highway 12 is and what it will not be in the near future, that our objective should be to keep jobs in our community. And so we talked a lot about residential. When you think about industrial or just businesses in general, is there any kind of formula that could be used to see whether we have enough property available for commercial? So if a large business wants to come in, it would potentially employ X number of people, and their residents would be able to support that business.
You used the term commercial, but I think that if you see higher density employment, it's not going to be commercial. What I'm seeing in other communities is Yeah, there's still interest in logistics,
Mhm.
but there's also interest in higher end light industrial, assembly, research and development. We have proximity to the wine industry. There's certain jobs that track with that. So there's a lot of work that Pam and Don are doing that are going to help us understand what are the jobs that we might be able to capture? What's naturally the fit? It's really hard to buck economics.
Yeah, I
But-
just want to make sure that we don't have a plan that's to build out a community of all residences and then there's no space for any jobs. That'd be a tragedy.
I think that our job space will probably be more in the light industrial R&D assembly realm is my guess, but I really look forward to understanding better what comes out of the economic development report. We have ground inside the city. We currently have underutilized buildings.
Mhm.
I don't think we lack enough space for commercial to have a really nice downtown. I think we lack the tenants to fill the spaces at the moment.
Right.
So, but that is not, that question is kind of in line with what I was mentioning for Del Rio Hills. And the idea that if we do want a medical complex, if we do want an office complex, conventional office, probably not, but smaller suite office spaces, maybe. So there could be place there.
I think you need one more circle on this map.
What is that?
You didn't circle the Harris Church property.
I had, but it got so messed up that you couldn't read it anymore. Yeah, and it does accommodate, we're guessing probably on the order of 400 or 500 homes total. So it's part of the puzzle, absolutely.
Paul, I have a question about those two ovals that you talked about in the upper left area. If it's not within the city limits and Flannery buys them, does it make sense for us to try to annex them before they buy them? Or does it make any sense at all to annex them once they buy them?
I think it makes sense to make our interest known to the property owners. Because if the property owners are saying, I've got an acre of land and it's worth $10,000 for agricultural purposes and somebody's offering me 15, that's a heck of a deal.
Mhm.
If that property owner is thinking, well, wait, what's that worth for urban development? That might be orders of magnitude greater. So our willingness to entertain expansions, and that's something we're going to have to talk about in this discussion, is should we be considering a sphere of influence expansion? So that we do have land within the sphere that's available for growth and development. Right now, we don't have a lot of sphere land that would accommodate residential. When we started the housing element process, the county looked at Rio Vista and said, my gosh, you guys can accommodate all the housing units we need in the whole county. And then I started talking with folks in the city and found out, well, maybe not, maybe not. This land is constrained in this way. This is constrained in that way. So I think we do need to be thinking down the road to try to preserve some options because they do seem to be closing in on us. I think we're down to the next steps. Well, sorry, I thought you were done. Nope, not quite. So this is a recap. Next steps on land use designations. We've been through this. What we're going to do is work on shaking out the existing designations, looking for where we can consolidate, bring a little bit better rationale. We're going to work on the descriptions, and that will all flow into the land use element part of our work. You know what? I'm not going to torture you guys. We've talked all those through. I don't think we need to recap. So your input was wonderful. Nick and I have taken lots and lots of notes. Where we're going to go from here is to start to refine a land use map that's going to be somewhere between those yellow bubbles and the actual map, but start drawing some lines. We've got some direction on some of the industrial areas that was really good. In those areas where we think that there's some changes going on, we'll work those up and bring them back. We will continue to work on the build out assumptions, try to true those up a little bit. You saw a back of the napkin this evening. We'd like to truth those out a little bit. And then our next meeting is going to be, we believe, this is not entirely confirmed, but we believe it's on October 20th. And that will be with Fair and Peers, and they're going to come in and start really working through the circulation discussion. So that's going to be Highway 12, that's going to be mobility, surface streets, the whole thing. And so that will be really their kickoff meeting for them to share what they've learned so far and start to hear from the community about what we need for circulation.
It would be nice to have, as we talk about land use or mobility, I found it awkward tonight to not have a map that I could view as you talked and we moved between the different pieces. That last one, the green with the yellow ovals, and you had one, it was probably about slide 4 or so, that had some nice streets named and blocking out. That would be greatly appreciated as we
11
continue.
by 17, big enough?
Sure,
Would
that's
that
perfect.
work?
That would
Okay,
work, yeah.
because we'll give you whatever you need. So we'll
Yep.
put together a set of maps and get them distributed out so you can start drawing on them and marking them up and get your ideas on paper. Okay.
I was using Google Maps to kind of follow around. Yeah.
You saw me doing the same. didn't you?
Well, it's easier to, relate.
Yeah,
So,
no,
it-
absolutely. And if there's any tools that will help make this easier for you, don't hesitate to ask. That's, we want to help you through this process as much as possible.
real quickly about the Edwin's, the concerns about the business and, not creating just like a little hub of residences and no room for business. I think it's really sad that until Caltrans wakes up or somebody wakes up and realizes they've got to do something about Highway 12. That's probably why we more than likely lost the Amazon Center to Oakley. This probably would have been a good location for it, but they look at Highway 12 and they say, no way, forget it. But, so.
Doesn't seem to stop their trucks though.
No, it doesn't. It's amazing how many trucks drive through here each day, going west in the morning and back east in the afternoon. So but yeah, I think it's a really sad situation. I don't know if it'll ever get fixed.
It will require a lot of investment in Highway 12 and not any one section. So it's gonna, Highway 12 will need to be recognized at a different level.
There'll be flying cars before we get a better Highway 12.
Okay, I kid you not, in another city, I'm now processing the Hyundai America test facility for autonomous vertical I don't know what it is. Flying cars. They've got these fancy names, and this is out in the Mojave Desert, and they are getting serious about developing vehicles that will do deliveries by drone. So it's not that far off. So
I think you should get a dog named Astro.
just want the housekeeper.
I don't think the younger people on here know what we're talking about.
Anything else before we wrap up?
Do you
Thank
want
you.
to, you want to finish with your staff announcements with the meetings with the park and rec and?
I don't have the agenda in front of me, so.
It
Oh,
says,
the Park and Rec meeting. We had a great meeting with the Park and Rec. It was a beginning of a discussion, not a conclusion. What we've asked is that the commission really get familiar with the Parks Master Plan. The Parks Master Plan's from, I think, 2007. It was in the process of being updated in 2013, never quite got adopted. I think I understand what happened now, but really it's a pretty good Parks Master Plan. But we want to make sure the commission feels good about it, and then they can start feeding into us on the park and recreation element, which we've actually are tackling as our first element. So we're going to take one of our easier elements to set it up for form, presentation, kind of structure. And that may be the first element you see as a relatively complete draft. We'll be going back to the Parks Commission this month, I believe, and checking back in as they wanted to spend more time reviewing the Parks Master Plan.
And then also on the agenda, you have economic development strategy status.
Yeah, we are, well, Pam has been really leading the effort with our economic development consultant. We do have an internal admin draft forming up of the work product. And we're really going to be, the economic development plan is going to benefit from the general plan update, and the general plan update's going to benefit from the economic development plan. They're going to be separate documents, but it's really clear that getting economic development, both for the benefit of the residents, for the jobs, for the revenue, there's a whole bunch of reasons that it's a really high priority. And so we want to make sure that we are considering that, just as Edwin mentioned about, you know, do we have the space that's going to accommodate the jobs to serve the community? Our economic development report and strategy will help to inform that and give us some idea of, you know, what we really should be planning for. And then we can step back and say at a big level, at a high level, are we really seeing the big picture? Are we accommodating what we think we'll need? So those efforts are going along. Pam, would you like to offer anything else? You're really leading that effort.
Can you hear me? Hello, hello. Okay, sorry. So as Paul had mentioned that Dawn and I have been working together on this effort since June, and we have presented to the city manager an internal draft, and Dawn's back to the drawing board and taking the feedback that we have. Meanwhile, since June, we have been outreaching with the community, and we've been sending the messaging across that this is our economic development plan. We want to have people understand that it's everybody needs to have ownership of this. And so we continue on, and so far, maybe about a month from now, we're going to revisit in the plans of presenting it to the open community. We'll see what the city manager would say on that one, and then pretty much present it before council. We're setting up the milestones, but we are treading ahead. Are there any questions?
Anybody have anything else?
Thank you.
I understand McDonald's is serving breakfast, so I will adjourn the meeting. Thank you.
Bye.